Good evening. You must have seen headlines and hoardings about India hosting the G20 Summit later this year. They are all over the national capital. Preparations are in full swing, and many would say a global spotlight, so to speak, is on India. My name is Anubha Bhonsle, and tonight on Newsworthy, we are explaining the G20 presidency, of course, and if this one, India holding the G20 presidency, is indeed a big deal or not. Well, India took over the G20 presidency on the 1st of December last year from Indonesia. As part of this, India will be chairing over 200 meetings on a variety of subjects. So, digital infrastructure, climate change, sustainable development goals, among others. These meetings are going to happen across the country in 55 locations. 5 have already happened. 11 more are scheduled to take place just this month. The main summit, that's going to take place later this year, likely in September. India there is expecting the attendance of heads of 19 countries and the President of the European Council. We're also expecting heads of international organizations, the UN, WHO, FIFA, and 10 guest countries to be in attendance. So, needless to say, all eyes are on India. But having the G20 presidency is not a big deal on its own. The presidency goes to each of the 20 countries that are part of this group by rotation, and now it's simply India's turn. Remember, it's also not the first time we've become the president of this group. But some would say it is the first time that we're seeing so much conversation around it. It is splashed all over on hoardings, and mind you, not just in capital cities. So the question is, what is the G20? What does it do? And why is it a big deal? Well, the G20 was formed in 1999 as a consequence of the economic crisis in East Asia. At that point in time, it started with just finance ministers and the central bank governors who were in attendance. Now, India chaired that meeting in 2002. But after the 2008 financial crisis, the G20 membership was raised to levels of heads of government. And the focus, well, that also expanded in a sense from just matters of global economy. Now, since then, that is since 2008, this is the first time India is chairing the meeting. As I said before, it goes in rotation. So Brazil gets it next, and then it will be South Africa, after which all 20 nations would have had this chance once. But there is a sense that India's presidency is special. Well, not just because Prime Minister Modi has talked about it and underlined it several times, but also because of the moment in time in which it is happening. There are many events globally that are impacting all of us. Russia's war in Ukraine, China, the lingering impacts of COVID-19, and a global slowdown that is staring the world. India, some would say, is in a unique position to lead on all these fronts. Number one, India has often pointed to the devastating effects of Russia's war on global supply chains and developing economies. The war's impact on global food and energy security figured really high at the Indonesia talks that took place last year, but those remained inconclusive. India, with its close and pragmatic relations, some would say, with Russia and America, is in a unique position to bridge the divide and bring an isolated Russia into some of the meetings. This is something that many international organizations, the UN and allied bodies, have failed to do so. Now, we live in such a world that even getting all the major countries to sit around the table itself is a big deal. And at a time when there is a global recession, fair to say, India seems to be faring better than the rest of the world.
We also find ourselves at the center of the troika of G20 presidencies: Indonesia, India, and Brazil, all emerging economies. There is a chance to amplify the concerns of the global south in a big way on climate change, healthcare, and trade. India has consistently done some of this on other platforms. At the COP climate change talks, India sought technological and financial support to enable developing countries to transition to greener technologies. At the World Trade Organization, India has lobbied for lower tariffs and non tariff barriers. India is also working on sustainable development goal stimulus packages for governments, offering debt relief and restructuring. The G20 countries account for 80% of the global GDP, 75% of global trade, and 60% of the global population. So, a G20 presidency is definitely an opportunity to double down on credibility as a global South leader. Like every time, there will be a Sherpa track and the finance track. Each G20 country selects an official representative, they are called Sherpas. India has chosen Niti Aayog CEO Amitabh Kant. In the lead up to the main summit in September, Sherpas will form 13 working groups to discuss everything from agriculture, economic development to education and climate change. The G20 finance track will discuss, among other things, international taxation, financial inclusion, and financing future health emergencies like the pandemic, when finance ministers and central bank governors of countries meet. Besides this, there are non-government participants from each G20 nation. So think business organizations, think tanks, audit firms, startups, civil society. They will meet to provide recommendations to the G20 leaders. Again, important to underline, this happens every year. But the fact that it is happening at a time when developing economies have the most to lose and say puts India in a privileged position to lead. Unlike the COPs, the G20 summits have resulted in some tangible change. G20 is widely recognized as exercising considerable global influence. It is credited with strengthening the role of emerging economies, reforming international financial institutions, and tightening oversight. It has succeeded in coming up with, among other things, a framework for debt treatments and a proposal to create a fund for pandemic preparedness and response. The G20 is also criticized for its limited membership and lack of enforcement powers. For instance, after Indonesia handed over the G20 presidency to India, it went on to pass a series of regressive criminal law reforms, which included a ban on premarital and extramarital sex and punishment for expressing views contrary to national ideology. No G20 country said a word or held it accountable to international human rights standards. This time, India has the chance to set the agenda. 6 priorities have been identified: digital infrastructure, climate action and climate finance, sustainable and inclusive energy transition, accelerated progress on sustainable development goals, women-led development, and reforms of multilateral institutions. India has demonstrated its ability to bring complex negotiations to breakthroughs, like it did in Bali last year when the final statement went out with consensus of all G20 nations. Another positive runoff effect of India's G20 presidency will be the impact on its tourism industry, which could really use a push after the pandemic. Meetings will be held across 55 cities, including at least one in every state's capital. In many states in India's northeast, 100 viewpoints are being constructed across highways. Besides words, leaders and officials are experiencing the diversity and culture of every region.
Now, absolutely fair to say that this is marketing India to the world, or at least a carefully thought out and constructed idea of India. Remember, we were actually supposed to host the G20 last year, but asked if it could be postponed to 2023 instead. It would be remiss if we didn't consider how this presidency and how this G20 summit ahead of India's general elections due in 2024 could help bolster Prime Minister Modi's reputation at home as a leader of international stature. Critics will also question whether there is hypocrisy in declaring unity in diversity, Vasudevaya Kutumbakam, or the world as one family, as a theme for this G20 summit at a time when diversity, some would say, is irksome within the country for many. That is also a fair point. But if anything, the G20 presidency is a chance for India to be on its best behavior. I'm going to leave it there. I'm hoping this video was useful for you, was worthy of your time. Once again, my request to you is threefold. Please share this video. Number 2, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. You hear it often, but it is essential for a small channel like ours. And number 3, please use the super thanks feature and make a contribution for Newsworthy. You can also do that via Razorpay. The link is in the bio or in the description if you're watching this on Instagram. We're going to see you again very soon.